Okay, hi everybody, and glad you came. I see the crowd is getting bigger and bigger, although I wouldn't yet call it overwhelming, but thank you for coming out. And today we deal with what is considered to be the most mysterious of all of the mitzvot of the Torah. We have the mitzvah of Duma, of the red heifer, and this is a particular ritual in which the Torah says you have to find a para that has to be all red. All red does not mean fire engine red. I used to think when I was a child that you had to find a fire engine cow, which you're not going to find. Essentially, orange-brown is good enough. That's what we're talking about, but which is a common color among many types of cattle, but it has to be 100%. You're only allowed one black hair. If there's two black hairs, it is disqualified. And that para is slaughtered. It is then burnt into ashes. The ashes are mixed with spring water. And then, whenever somebody comes in contact with the dead, and they're tameh for 7 days, the way they are purified is on day 3 and on day 7. They are sprinkled with even a drop of the water and the ashes. And then on day 7, they go to the mikveh, and then at night they're going to be tahor. So para aduma is the necessary prerequisite to become purified from the tuma, from the contamination that arises when we connect to a corpse. Now, let me point out, therefore, since Bisman Hazeh we don't have the para aduma, every once in a while some group claims to have a para aduma, but even if we had the animal, we would have to prepare it. In fact, there's a circularity here. Only pure Kohanim can burn the ashes and prepare the para aduma. So, by definition, to make a new para aduma, you have to have some ashes of an old para aduma that can purify the participants. So today we're in a double bind. Even if we had the para aduma, we would have literally no way to prepare it. What's going to happen when Mashiach comes is, Eliyahu Hanavi is going to bring a jar of some leftover ashes of the last para aduma. He will purify some Kohanim, and then they'll be able to make a new one that will help the rest of us. Yeah.
Could it be possible for a Kohen or a Kohen, a Mount Kohen, to have been born in, let's say, outside of the city or outside of the place of ever getting contaminated by the dead? And
yeah, there actually is a discussion in the Gemara itself, in the Mishnah itself, about Kohanim who could be born in isolated places on tops of mountains, and they were never exposed to a corpse, and as a result they are tahor, and therefore if you wait 13 years, they will then be able to make a para aduma. And the Mishnah actually discusses such a group. I understand that around 10 years ago, there was a group of very religious people who wanted to raise children that way, and the police broke it up because of child abuse. They treated it as child abuse, kind of whatever, because you'd have to do a lot of kind of isolation. The kids could not be connected to anybody else, and the like. So essentially, the catch-22 is you can't make a para aduma without a para aduma is going to be resolved when Mashiach comes. Now, the fact that all of us are tamei met is not necessarily a problem with everything. Even a person who's tamei met, we daven, we learn, we do mitzvot, we keep Shabbat. Being tamei met does not mean you're a pariah. There is essentially only one or two things that a tamei met is not allowed to do. You are not allowed to enter the area that is the temple area and the courtyard of the temple. And number two, you're not allowed to eat korbanos, which we don't bring anyway, or truma that you give to a kohen. Now, I don't want to get too much into the halachic detail, but this is essentially the controversy, whether we're allowed to enter the Temple Mount. As you know, most Orthodox Jews do not enter the Temple Mount. Some Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jews, do enter the Temple Mount. And let me explain what the machlokas is. The machlokas is this. Everybody admits that the part of the Temple Mount that was actually the temple and the courtyard a tamei met is absolutely not allowed to enter. But those who do enter the outer rim of the Temple Mount say that that is outside of the temple courtyard, and therefore they are permitted to go there. Those who don't say it's too much of an uncertainty. It's like walking into a minefield. If I were to tell you, oh, you can walk here, the mine is 6 inches away, don't worry about it, most of us would not be very comfortable doing that. So really, the machlokes between those who go and those who don't is not a machlokes in halachic principle. Everybody admits the inner part of the Temple Mount is usher, and in theory, the outer part of the Temple Mount is mutter. Everybody's moted to those halachas. The question is, how confident are you in your identification of when does the outer become the inner? But that is essentially why we cannot go. Now let me point out, women have a separate issue. If a woman is a nida, or a man for that matter had a seminal emission, and the woman did not go to the mikveh yet, she cannot enter any part of the Temple Mount, no matter what. So in a way, it's a little awkward. Even if I, as a man, can enter the outer part of the Temple Mount, if my only problem is not having para Duma, a woman has an additional halachic issue of her nida status, unless she went to the mikveh and she's in a state of purity. So it's complicated. It's very, very clear in the Torah. We'll talk about the spiritual meaning of this shortly, that purity and impurity, tuma and tara, which are really words that you can't even translate, but we commonly translate them as purity and impurity, are very, very important concepts in biblical theology and in halacha as well. There's a whole order of the Mishnah, a very difficult order of the Mishnah that many people don't really learn that well, called taharos, about purity and impurity. But today, by and large, most of those rules do not apply simply because we don't have the mechanisms to purify us. So para aduma is the indispensable necessity to become purified from the tuma that you contract when you're in proximity to a dead body. That means you either touch a dead body, or you move a dead body, or you carry a dead body, or you're under the same roof with a dead body, and that would even include an overhanging tree. There are a lot of different ways you can catch it. And once you catch it, you can't get rid of it without the sprinkling of the para aduma, ashes mixed with water. Now, this is not immersion. You have to go to the mikveh in addition to that. Mikveh we have today, but this is called haza'ah, sprinkling. Now, this is described as chok. Zot chukas Torah. Now, what is a chok? A chok is a law for which we have no intelligible understanding. There are many laws of the Torah that make a lot of sense. Don't kill, don't steal. They are called mishpatim. Chukim are laws that, God must know the reason, but we don't really understand what they are. And this is called the chok par excellence, because it is so inexplicable. But what is so inexplicable about it? Well, there's quite a lot of stuff. Why a cow? Why red? Why ashes? Why mixed with spring water? Why am I sprinkled twice? But on the other hand, as strange as that is, I have to say it's not much stranger than a lot of other things that are strange. Shatnez. Why wool and linen? Why can you only eat animals that have split hooves and chew their cud? Meaning, once you start saying that things don't make pure logical sense, then this is not necessarily the exclusive candidate for the chok. So what makes this the chok of all choks? The inexplicable of the most inexplicable? The answer is that it is not simply the strangeness of the ritual, although it is a strange ritual. It is the paradox of the ritual. Because paradoxically, the ashes of the para aduma purify those who are tamei, and yet everybody that handles those ashes becomes tamei in the process. So the same thing that is a vehicle for purifying the impure is a vehicle for contaminating the pure. So part of what makes this a chok is the concept of paradox, contradiction. Now, I just want to stop here because people sometimes raise a question. If it's true that anybody that handles the ashes becomes ritually impure, don't you have a problem that you'll never be able to get the Jewish people in a 100% level of impurity? Let's imagine Mashiach comes. We have a Parah Duma. So, I'm not a Kohen, but first of all, let's assume I'm a Kohen for a moment. So I sprinkle you, I'm Tameh. So then somebody else has to sprinkle me, and they're Tameh. And then somebody has to sprinkle him, and he's Tameh. So the problem is you have like an infinite regression where there's going to be a last guy holding the bag who's going to be Tameh, and if you find another guy to purify him, then he's going to be Tameh. How is it possible for all of Klal Yisrael to become Tohar? It's a question that might occur to people, but let me point out it is not a question at all. And the reason it's not a question at all is that the only Tuma that needs sprinkling with the ashes of Parah Duma is the Tuma that you get by contact with a corpse. So, if you were in contact with a corpse by touching, by carrying, by moving, by being in the same building, you need to be sprinkled with Parah Duma. Now it's true that I who sprinkle you, I become Tameh. But I didn't become Tameh by contact with the corpse. I became Tameh by contact with Parah Duma. All I have to do is go to the mikveh, and I'm going to be pure at night. So, what will the last guy have to do? The last guy, the last sprinkler, will simply be able to jump into the mikveh, and at nightfall he will be pure, and all of Klal Yisrael will be pure. In other words, again, it is not that every case of Tuma needs Parah Duma. A Nida every month does not need Parah Duma. The only one that needs Parah Duma is contact with a dead corpse. Okay. And again, the contact can be touching, carrying, moving, or being under the same roof, including a tree and the like. Now, this overlaps with the law of Kohanim, but be sure you understand the difference. A Kohen is not allowed to become Tameh to a Met. A Yisrael is allowed to be Tameh to a Met, but both a Kohen and a Yisrael, if they did become Tameh, are subject to the same purification rituals. So these purification rituals are not limited to Kohanim. They apply even if I'm a Yisrael. I want to bring a korban, I want to go into the Beit HaMikdash, I have to have the sprinkling of the Parah Aduma. And it's pretty amazing that if you think about how many Jews throughout Jewish history needed to be sprinkled when there was a Beit HaMikdash, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and more than once during the year. And multiply that by the number of years. And it's amazing that we are told that throughout our history, from Moshe Rabbeinu until the destruction of the temple, there were only 10 Parah Adumas that were needed, and the 10th one is actually going to be saved. So really only 9 were used up, and the 10th one is going to be Limot Mashiach. So really it was kind of a miracle that it lasted so long.
You would just water it down?
Yeah, so here's the thing. So technically, if you study the technicalities, it's very interesting. You have to mix the ashes in the spring water. But you don't have to sprinkle people with the ashes. So for example, I could just put a tiny bit of ash, one piece of ash, in a gigantic vat of water, and I can keep on adding water. I can keep on adding and adding and adding and adding. And when people are sprinkled, you don't have to deplete the ashes. You can leave the ashes in there and just like sprinkle them with the water. So that's apparently how they did it. So B'kitzur, therefore, Parah Aduma exemplifies the idea of paradox. And that is why Shlomo HaMelech says in the book of Ecclesiastes, Amarti echkama, I said I wanted to seek wisdom. V'hi rechoka mimeni, and I saw that wisdom was beyond me. And the Gemara explains, or the Medrash explains rather, that he went through every single mitzvah and he understood it. But once he got to Parah Aduma, it didn't make sense to him. And then he realized, the Meforshim say, that all of the Torah is beyond me. From the Chukim we understand that even the part of the Torah that's intelligible to me, that makes sense, contains depths of meaning that are beyond human comprehension. And this gives rise to an important question. When the Torah introduces the Parah Duma, it begins with the words, Zos Chukas HaTorah. This is the chok, the statute, the inexplicable law of the Torah. Now the Mefarshim ask a question. Given the fact that this is not the whole Torah, it's only one particular commandment, the Torah should not have said, Zos Chukas HaTorah. It should have said, Zot Chukat HaPara. This is the law of the Parah. Why does it say, Zot Chukat HaTorah, as if there's something about the whole Torah in Parah Duma? So I'm going to give you three answers. Answer number one is from the Or HaChaim. The Or HaChaim points out an interesting idea that in the law of purity, the greater the sanctity of life, the greater the impurity is in the absence of that life. So for example, a dead human being has a much higher degree of impurity than a dead animal. If I touch a dead animal, I am tameh for only one day, and I don't need Parah Duma. I just go to the mikveh and I'm tahor. If I touch a dead human, I'm tameh for 7 days. A dead human has a much greater tuma than a dead animal. A dead Jewish person has a greater level of tuma than a dead non-Jew, because a non-Jew conveys tuma only by touching and carrying. It's only the Jew that conveys tuma being under the same roof. A dead plant does not have tuma at all, unless a dead animal touched it. But a dead plant, mitzad itself, has no tuma. Which means tuma is something that results from the vacuum and absence of a life force that was holy and special. And therefore, the greater the holiness, the greater the tuma. That is why human greater than animal, Jew greater than non-Jew, etc. Animal greater than plant, which has no tuma at all. So therefore it turns out that Zot Chukat Torah, all the laws of purity and impurity, derive from the holiness that the Torah imparted into the soul of human beings and the Jewish people in particular. And therefore, when it says this is the chok of the Torah, it doesn't only refer to Parah Duma, it refers to the whole concept of purity and impurity. Is not an intrinsic natural phenomenon. It's not like, germ contamination or something like that. It is a construct that emanates from a holiness which, when vacated, creates a vacuum, and that vacuum generates tuma, and that's Zot Chukat HaTorah. That is the Or HaChaim's answer, and that is answer number one. Answer number two is a fascinating thought of the Vilna Gaon that's a little controversial. Everyone knows the famous teaching that the Torah is compared to water. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Just like water purifies and water is necessary for life, and water goes from high ground to low ground, so the Torah leaves the arrogant and goes to the humble. Right? So there are many, many reasons why Torah is compared to water. But the Vilna Gaon gives a strikingly original reason. And the reason he gives is the following. If I pour water on soil, and in that soil there are seeds, the water will cause or enable those seeds to sprout and grow. But the water is indifferent if those seeds are wheat or those seeds are poisonous weeds. Water will be matzmiach, what is ever in the ground, whether it's good or whether it's bad. Water is a medium of growth. So too says the Vilna Gaon. This is quite amazing coming from the Vilna Gaon. Torah will accentuate whatever midot, whatever character traits you have in your personality. If you are kind, if you are compassionate, if you are loving, the Torah will make you a kinder, compassionate, a more loving person. Well, nobody disagrees with that, but listen to the second part of the sentence. If, God forbid, you're a person who is selfish, who is arrogant, the learning of the Torah will make the arrogance even more pronounced.
Could or will?
Well, he doesn't say will, but he says it. There's a lot of contradictions on this, because there are many, many passages that the Vilna Gaon himself brings that the Torah could change you for the good. But the Vilna Gaon says you have to be committed to wanting to change for the good. If you're not committed to wanting to change for the good, this is an amazing thought. The Vilna Gaon was not a person who did not give importance to Torah learning. And yet the Vilna Gaon said, without consciously trying to become a better person, it's not going to be an automatic process. The Torah, which can purify one type of person, can actually contaminate another type of person. It can be another avenue for competition, another way of arrogance, another method of showing one-upmanship. I think we see this in the world sometimes. So the Vilna Gaon says...
You have to be committed to wanting to be arrogant?
No, I meant the other way around. In order for the Torah to improve you, you have to be committed to wanting to change. In other words, if you have bad seeds in you, the Torah is going to make those bad seeds grow, whatever in you, unless you are committed to wanting to change and getting rid of those bad seeds.
Don't we also say, like, if you're doing it lo lishma, bezrat Hashem, it can become lishma? So
Yeah, that's exactly right. But again, the Vilna Gaon says what that means is that even if I learn for ulterior motives, I'm doing it with the hope that I eventually will serve God lishma. Mitoch shelo lishma has to be part of your mental process. And that's why, by the way, the Vilna Gaon is said to be the spiritual forefather of the Musar movement that was started by Yisrael Salanter towards the latter third of the 19th century. There were those who were against Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. There were those who took the position, if you're learning Torah, that's all you need. You don't have to work on your personality. The Torah is going to straighten you out. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said, Torah is the healthy diet for the healthy soul. But just as if somebody is sick, they need some medication besides their normal diet. So working on one's midot, etc., musar, is something that the sick soul needs for a tikkun. And that's largely based on the Vilna Gaon's teachings. Now, again, this is a huge machlokas. We could easily give a course on this subject, that the Musar movement had many, many detractors, some of whom were very eminent people. But the Vilna Gaon himself seems to basically say that Torah is going to accentuate the negative within you unless you have a conscious effort to try to uproot it. So now, this is with the comparison to Parah Aduma. Parah Aduma is a medium where the very same thing that can purify you can make you worse. Zos Chukata Torah, that paradox is in the Torah itself. The Torah itself is mitaher. It can purify a person who's tameh, but it can also ruin a person if he has the negative midot that have to be uprooted. So that's the second answer of why it says Zos Chukas HaTorah.
But the brothers talk about someone who's bad to begin with, not the Kohen who was tahor.
No, well, that's correct. But again, a person could be tahor. Yeah, it's a good point. I see what you're saying. But a person could be tahor in terms of his observance and everything else. But deep inside, there are nitiyot that are very, very negative. Now, a third answer is a point that Rav Chaim Shmulevitz used to make, and he used to make the point that in many ways, the way we deal with chukim really defines the way we're connected to the whole Torah. Because like this, if I keep the parts of the Torah that make sense to me, we're never really sure, and I'm never really sure, am I serving God Or am I simply a fellow traveler walking with God as long as it makes sense to me? So, keeping the mishpatim does not yet demonstrate the unconditional submission to the Ribono Shel Olam. But when I obey those parts of the Torah that bedafka do not make sense to me, then what I am demonstrating is my connection to all of the Torah, not just the Chok. My connection to all of the Torah is one of submission and obedience, rather than simply following whatever I think is right. And therefore the Chok is so important, because the Chok is the definition of your Avodat Hashem. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz used to point out quite often that the one thing a human being does not like to be is a human being does not like to be beholden. A human being doesn't like to do anything because we're forced to do it. We always want to be in the position where we're doing it because we want to do it, not because someone is making us do it, right? So the husband that is about to take out the garbage because he wants to do his wife a favor, and as he's about to take out the garbage, his wife calls from the other room, please take out the garbage, on their way out. The husband, I'm not being autobiographical, the husband will have a moment of resentment in which he says, I don't like to be told what to do. He was going to do it anyway, but he was going to do it because he wanted to do it. When someone says do it, it kind of takes away all the fun, takes away all the credit. This is why there's an interesting Gemara. The Gemara says that a person who does a mitzvah that he's commanded to do gets more reward from God than a person who does a mitzvah they're not commanded to do. So, for example, if a woman sits in the sukkah, which she is exempt from because it's a time-bound commandment, she gets reward. Hashem rewards her for it. Ashkenazim even make a bracha. A woman can make a bracha, leishei basukah. But her reward on that one, is less than the man, because the man is commanded to do it. And that which you do when you're commanded is a greater mitzvah than that which you do when you're not commanded, even though you get reward. And in fact, the Marshal says that is why we make a party when someone is bar mitzvah, because until they were bar mitzvah, they were not commanded. Now they're commanded. So Tosafos asks an obvious question. Doesn't logic indicate the opposite? If I do something that I have to do, I don't deserve a pat on the back. That's my job. If I go beyond the halacha, it's like time and a half for overtime. I should get more reward when I do something I don't have to do, because I'm doing more than I have to do. So Tosafos says a very interesting psychological idea, that once you have to do something, you have a much stronger Yetzer Hara not to do it, because of the stubbornness of the human personality. So it's actually easier to do a mitzvah you don't have to do than to do a mitzvah you have to do. Because once you have to do it, there's a rebelliousness within me. I don't want to be given orders. That's why you'll find sometimes, although there may be other reasons, that a kid before his bar mitzvah will get up for minyan and be so enthusiastic. And once he's 13, once he has to do it, he may lose some of the enthusiasm. That's why in the Reform movement, one of the positive things that has happened in recent years is there's been a growth in the percentage of Reform Jews that put on Tefillin every morning. Right? More and more Reform Jews are putting on Tefillin. But the growth is almost 100% women and not men. And one of the explanations is women are not obligated to put on Tefillin. So for them it's an exciting, great, wonderful thing. Man has to do it. I don't want to do what I have to do. That's boring. I don't want to get orders. So the chok is the opposite idea, in which I do something not because I want to do it, not because it makes sense to me, not because it's logical. I do it simply because I got to do it. And that's an important attitude. Obviously Hashem wants us to want the mitzvos. But we have to have this backup idea that even if I'm not inspired, even if it doesn't excite me, there's this backup, default, absolute position. I do what I gotta do because I gotta do it. And then I work on seeing the meaning, I work on the joy, I work on the inspiration. But I have to know that even if none of that comes, there is this absolute obedience and submission. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz gave another example of this idea. If you remember, when David HaMelech when David HaMelech, towards the end of his life, was being pursued by his own son Avshalom. And there was a man, Shimi ben Gera, who was a relative of Shaul, and he was cursing David, and he was saying, now God is punishing you for what you did to my relative Shaul HaMelech. And when David was on his deathbed, he gave an instruction to his son Shlomo, be sure that you punish Shimi ben Gera. Find some pretense to punish him. So Shlomo HaMelech said something to Shimi ben Gera that's very peculiar. He told Shimi ben Gera, I'm putting you under house arrest. You cannot leave your estate. He had a big estate. And the day that you leave your estate, you're going to be killed. So he put him under house arrest. And it was not a small house. It is then recorded that there were donkeys of Shimi ben Gera that wandered away, and Shimi ben Gera went to look for those donkeys. He was being watched, he got apprehended, and he was executed. Now this is a very strange thing. Shimi ben Gera didn't leave his house because he wanted to go to his mother's funeral or his son's graduation. He went to look for some donkeys. He had servants. He knew that his life was in danger. He knew he was being watched. What type of idiot is going to leave his house when he knows that his life is in danger? I do not intend to draw analogies to COVID-19. Baruch Hashem, I would not describe leaving your house as falling within that category. But Shimi ben Gera, for sure, that was. And Reb Chaim Shmulevitz says, if he wouldn't have been told not to leave, he wouldn't have left. Donkeys, he has plenty of servants looking for his donkeys. But once he is given an order, he can never leave his house. Staying in his house becomes unbearable. He can't stay another inch. He says, I'm going to go. Maybe they're not going to see me. Maybe I'll escape. That's the way it is. When you have to do something, that's bedafka when it's so hard to do. Until you have to do it, it wouldn't be a problem. Shimi ben Gera might have stayed at home his whole life had he not been told he's never allowed to leave. Once he is told he's allowed to leave. In fact, the truth is, I remember reading various Holocaust stories where Jews sometimes had to be holed up in bunkers, in holes, in attics, in basements for days and days at a time. And you can imagine that you would go stir crazy. And yet, if you leave, your life is in danger. But there were people who had to get out. You can understand, they had to get out. And they would go out, and often they would be caught, and sometimes they weren't. But there is a point at which you just can't take it anymore. And I think many of us have experienced in recent months. So we do understand that idea. When you can't leave, that's when you have to leave. Okay. So that's Rav Chaim Shmulevitz's point, that it is the chok, zos chukat ha-Torah, it is the chok that demonstrates what your connection to God is. That I don't just serve God when it's convenient to me, but I serve God with kind of an unconditional submission to His will. But now, let's try to understand yet another teaching. Rashi brings a teaching of a rabbi from a prior generation. He is Rav Moshe the Darshan, Rav Moshe the preacher. And Rav Moshe HaDarshan tries to explain that although the Parah Aduma is not a korban, and again, I hope you understand this, there is nothing in the Parah Aduma that involved the Beis HaMikdash, meaning to say the sprinkling was not in the temple, the slaughtering of the parah was not in the temple. In other words, the sprinkling enabled you to go into the temple, but the Parah Aduma ritual was not a korban. There was no sacrificial ritual about it. But Rav Moshe HaDarshan wants to create a structure where the Parah Aduma is seen to be a kapara, an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. The same way, if a baby messes up, the mother must clean up the mess of the baby. So the para, the mother, the cow, is mechaperet on the mess of the ego, the calf. And he goes through how every single detail of the Parah Duma is kind of an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. And the question is, how can it be an atonement? It's not a korban, it's not a sacrifice. And exactly in what way is it an atonement? Just because cow, calf, mother, child? I mean, what is exactly the connection? So, here's what the Sfas Emes says. Let's go a little deeper into this. Let's look at the paradox of the Parah Duma. On one hand, if I am tamei, because I was in contact with a corpse, and I get sprinkled with the water and the ashes, I now become pure. Day 3, day 7, I go to the mikveh. On the other hand, the people that prepared and carried and transported the Parah Duma ashes, they're tamei for at least 1 day. Right? It's a paradox. How do you explain it? Now, obviously, if Shlomo HaMelech didn't understand it, we're not going to understand it. Nevertheless, partial explanations are actually offered in Svarim. Let's go back to the idea of Tuma. Rav Tzadok writes, all Tuma is connected to the idea of death. Obviously, contact with a corpse is contact with death. But really, even the tumos that are not connected to corpses are also connected to death. For example, a nida is ritually tamei every month. The shedding of a uterine lining is the loss of a potential life that could have been conceived that month. Dead animals are death. Leprosy, which is kind of a disintegration of the flesh, is a form of death. What about childbirth? If a woman gives birth to a child, she is tamei for 7 days in the case of a male, 14 days in the case of a female. How is childbirth connected to death? So Rav Hirsch says, very, very interesting. This is an amazing way of looking at childbirth. Even though childbirth is obviously a new life coming into the world, it actually is a death of a life that was within the woman's body. The woman was sustaining, the mother was sustaining a life. That life is no longer within her. That life has been externalized. Vis-a-vis the woman, there is a vacuum, there is a void. So we can assume, therefore, that the shirish of all the laws of impurity is connection with death in one way or the other. Point number 2. How and why did death come into the world? Originally, Adam and Chava were supposed to live forever. Because of the chait of the Eitz Hadas, God decreed there would be death. Albeit they had a very long life, they lived 930 years, but nevertheless there has to be a death there. What was the sin of the Eitz Hadas? I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, Rav Tzadok's idea, that death came into the world because of arrogance, because of gaiva, because of conceit. Because what the Nachash told Chava is, the day you eat from this fruit, you will be like God, to understand the nature of good and evil. Now, whatever that means, the Eitz Hadas is being marketed as a God pill. A pill, a fruit, a food that will give you the deepest, most profound understanding of divine wisdom. So death came into the world because of arrogance, hubris, the idea that man can be God. And it's very easy for us to fall into that trap, because in many ways we are godlike. We are made in the image of God. Tzelem Elokim. Now, being made in the image of God doesn't mean that God has a face. God does not have a physical image. But it refers to the attributes of God: intellect, autonomy, free will, the ability to create, the ability to accomplish. We are very godlike in our abilities. But the ultimate reminder that we are not God is that we lack immortality. That is the ultimate chasm, the ultimate dividing line between a borei, a creator, and a nivra, and a creation. So death came into the world not so much as a punishment, but death came into the world to remind mankind of their lowliness and their subservience to God. Death came into the world because of arrogance, and it is death that teaches us humility. Actually, death teaches us two things, really. Death teaches us humility, and death also teaches us the preciousness of life. Because the fact that life is finite and life is limited means you treasure and you cherish every moment. Because you can't say, I'll take care of the problem 10,000 years from now. We don't have 10,000 years. And as a result, carpe diem, seize the moment. That's why the Medrash says, very strangely, when God created everything, it says it was ki tov, it was good, it was good, it was good. And at the end it says he saw everything he created and it was very good. Well, how can good plus good plus good plus good be a very good? If you have a straight C average, it's not going to average up to a B. So the Medrash says, God made everything. He then added death to the equation. It was death that turned good into very good. That doesn't sound right. How does death make it a very good? The answer is, it makes life very special and very precious. So the concept in Judaism, which is a concept of remembering the day of death, is not meant to be depressing or pessimistic or frightening. It's meant to be energizing. It's meant to be, I want to make my life count because my time is not going to be unlimited. And therefore I want to do what I can in this life. But, going back to Adam and Chava, death came into the world through arrogance and gaiva. So now, listen to this. We become liberated from the impurity of death by rituals of humility and submission. Thus, mikvah. What is mikvah? One of the associations of mikvah is it is a returning to the helpless state of a baby in the womb. The mikveh has been described as a womb where you're floating in the water. And of course, you're in an utterly helpless environment because when you put yourself in water, you can't breathe, although it's only for a few seconds. It does highlight the vulnerability. And the second ritual of purification is Duma, which is ashes. Ashes is a symbol of humility and submission. Now obviously I'm not explaining why red, etc., but at least the concept of ashes in other words, it liberates you from death, because if death comes into the world because of arrogance, I become liberated from the impurity of death by ashes and by immersion, which is returning to the helpless dependent state of a newborn baby. And therefore it is out of my ashes that I achieve a new wholeness of identity. Just like in Greek mythology when you had the phoenix bird that was burnt to ashes, and out of the ashes came a new entity. And by the way, there's a medrash that says exactly the same thing, so I should say the name of the medrash. So too, by obliterating my ego and my arrogance and my gaiva, by obliterating that divider between me and God, I achieve new life, I achieve redemption, I achieve purity, I achieve liberation, and I am readmitted to the Garden of Eden. Because think about it this way, when I'm tameh, when I come in contact with death, that is in a little bit of a way a reenactment of the sin of eating from the Eitz Hadas that brought death into the world. Death is a reminder and a reconnection to the sin of the tree of knowledge. And just as the sin of the tree of knowledge necessitated an expulsion from the Garden of Eden, when I reenact and re-experience the sin of the Eitz Hadas, I get expelled from the Garden of Eden that exists in this earth, which is what? The Beis HaMikdash, the Temple Mount. Right? The temple is considered to be the Gan Eden of earth. In other words, I'm reenacting the Chet of the Eitz Hadas, and I have the consequences of the Eitz Hadas. Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. But I become liberated from that taint by the rituals of humility and submission, which are implicit in the ashes of the Parah Duma and in the immersion in the waters of the mikveh that simulate the womb and the dependency of a child on its mother, where the child knows it can do nothing by itself without the parent that will take care of it. So this is the basic explanation, a bit Kabbalistic, about how the Parah Duma, along with mikveh, is the vehicle of purification. Death comes into the world by arrogance. And therefore we're expelled from the Gan Eden again. We become liberated from that death, from that impurity, by humility and submission. But here's the thing, and this overlaps with what we talked about last week. So the connection is very, very similar. There is what you might call good humility, and there is what you might call bad humility. Because humility is a wonderful thing, but if taken in the wrong direction, it can be destructive. Because if a person truly feels they are worthless, they are nothing, they are nobody, then they will never have an understanding that what they do in the world matters. They will not attempt to be a force for good, because they will be overwhelmed with their ineffectuality and the meaningless of their isolated existence. So thus, we are taught that a person must have two ideas in his pockets at all times. There must be Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, because of me the world was created. God made many cows and horses and dogs and cats, but only one man and one woman, because each person must say the universe would have been justified for me alone. And at the same time, in your other pocket, Anochi Afar V'Yefer, I am dust and ashes. If all I have is Anochi Afar V'Yefer, I become paralyzed, ineffectual, passive. I never achieve the good that I'm able to achieve. I never accomplish the mission for which God put me in this earth. I need a Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam to make me realize how important I am in God's plans of things. On the other hand, if I only have Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, because of me the world was created, I am filled with arrogance and pride. And therefore I have to counterbalance Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam with Anochi Afar V'Yefer. And I have to balance Anochi Afar V'Yefer with Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, to know my worth, know my value, know my significance, recognize my talents, use them in good and constructive ways, but know that they are a gift from Hashem. And without Hashem, none of my efforts would ever bear fruit. So, let's go back to Parah Duma. On one hand, Parah Duma can purify from the greatest impurity. Because when death comes into the world through gaiva and arrogance, I become liberated, I become purified, I become empowered, I become redeemed by connecting to those ashes of humility and submission. And yet, at the same time, if those ashes convince you of your worthlessness and your ineffectuality, it will make you impure. The same midah of anava, of humility, which can purify the most impure person, can also destroy the pure person if he takes it the wrong way. And therefore, indeed, The paradigm of Anava cuts in two directions. It can elevate a person and make him holy, but it can also destroy a person. In fact, that's why we often find that there's a certain genre of Musar books that talk about the worthlessness of the human condition. You're a nothing, you're a nothing, you're a nothing. And often in yeshivos, students will be told not to study those books, simply because we're a weaker generation, and if we get too depressed and we get too upset, it's going to have a negative effect on us, meaning we're not necessarily strong enough to say, okay, I'm a nothing, but I still have a job to do and I'm going to do it. That's kind of the attitude. But you got to be a pretty strong person to do that. Most of us need to be told, we're great, we're wonderful, and then we go ahead and function. So as a result, in recent decades, the emphasis in chinuch has been much more on parenting as well, and rightly so, has been much more on positive affirmation rather than direct criticism. In reality, however, a person is supposed to live with both of those polarities at once. Be aware of my utter nothingness and be aware of my total greatness. And indeed, it's been well said, I think I may have mentioned this, that the great Rav Yerucham, the great mashgiach of the Mir Yeshiva, used to say that the person who is not aware of his faults, he thinks he's perfect, is a very foolish person, is an idiot. How can I possibly think that I'm perfect? But the person who is not aware of their greatness is a tragic person. Because the tragedy is, they'll never even realize the person they could have become, the life they could have had, the difference they could have made. How sad that is, that a person comes into the world and leaves the world without an awareness of all they could have done. And therefore, that's the paradox of Para Duma. The ashes can purify you and uplift you, and the ashes can contaminate you at the same time. Let me just end with one final thought that is unrelated, but it's a beautiful thought as well. And this is a medrash. And there are certain midrashim that are very enigmatic, and it's hard to explain. The medrash comments on Para Duma that the secret of Para Duma is Avas Yisrael. If you want to understand Para Duma, you have to understand what it means to love a fellow Jew. Hard to understand, right? What's the connection between Para Duma and loving a fellow Jew? So there's a beautiful explanation from one of the greatest Hasidic Rabbeim of the 19th century. This was the Apter Rav, the Rav of Apatow, called the Apter Rav. And the Apter Rav wrote a sefer that's called Ohev Yisrael, which is all about Avas Yisrael. And the Apter Rav says the following. We've been discussing that in the case of the Para Duma, I sprinkle you with the ashes, you become pure, and I, who was handling it, become impure. Right? That's the paradox. The Apter Rav says it's not really a paradox. Rather, it is the reason why it works. Because if I sprinkle you with ashes, what am I doing? I'm doing a chesed for you, even though it's going to cost me, even though it's going to be to my detriment, even though it's going to hurt me. I'm willing to put myself out in a way that will hurt me in order to benefit you. Says the Apter Rav, that is the unconditional love we have for our fellow Jew. And therefore, instead of saying, oh, how can the same thing purify and impurify at the same time, it works the opposite. The reason why it purifies you is because I'm willing to become impure myself. When I put myself out to help you, that brings holiness and purity into the world. And therefore the paradox of Para Duma is based on the purity that comes into the world through Avas Yisrael. They have again, it's an old Hasidic story about a father was teaching his child how to read. and he was looking at a chumash, and at the end of the chumash, the way you have a period in the chumash is like a colon. It's like one dot on top of another dot, although it looks like a yud, like one yud on top of a yud. So the kid thought it was a yud, and the father said, no. When you see one on top of the other, that is just a period. So then, when the child was reading, he came across two yuds that were side by side, which of course we read it as Hashem's name, and the kid just read it as a period. He stopped reading. So the father said, no. When you see the yuds that way, you pronounce it as Hashem's name. So the child asked his father, how come the first configuration was a period, and the second configuration is God's name? So the father answered, looks like a yud, right? Yud and yid are the same word, right? Yud. When one Jew is standing on top of another Jew, arrogance, gaiva, conceit, look down, the Torah stops. It can go no further. That's a period. That's the end of the pasuk. But when one yid stands next to another yid, togetherness, equality, respect, friendship, there is where the presence of God is located. A yud on top of a yud, the Torah goes no further. It is stopped. A yud next to a yud, that is God's name. And that is the Parah Duma, the willingness to make myself impure, to help another Jew, is the factor that brings purity into the world. So you'll have a good week and a good Shabbos, and thank you for coming.
Shaka shir shir chadya